So I told you yesterday that we butchered, I think, 5 chickens. So now we're canning them. We got 10 pint jars in each one of these canners. That's going to be 20 jars. And then next week we'll do the same thing. I tell you, this is, in my opinion, the best method to preserving meat. A lot of these guys will say, oh no, you don't want to can, you want to do this or that. So for example, they'll say freeze drying. Well, freeze drying, you need electric. We obviously don't have a lot of electric because we live off solar panels. So, and then we'll talk about dehydration. Yes, I know you can dehydrate meat. We actually have a dehydrator right here, sun drying dehydrator. I know you can do it, but it's not long-term preservation. I mean, beef jerky, you have to vacuum seal it. If you leave it out on the counter for a couple weeks, it'll go bad. Another type of preservation that we've done here is salt cure. Unless you put it in a vat of salt, the meat will spoil after about 2 weeks to a month. We've had one spoil after doing a salt cure. Smoking, same thing as dehydrating. You got to vacuum seal it. And even at that, I'm not too certain that it would actually preserve it. The key to preserving meat is getting the moisture out of it or putting it in a vacuum. Well, none of these methods that we talk about can get all the moisture out. So it reduces the amount of moisture in it and slows the rotting process, but after a while it will rot. Now, USDA says that you can only preserve canned meat for like a year. After that, you got to get rid of it. And I encourage you to follow the rules of the government, because if it say anything differently, YouTube will strike my video and say I'm giving out misinformation. But personally, I don't have a problem with it. We have meat in there that's a lot older than a year. If you feel the risk to violate the law, that's take your own risk. So I threw it out there. I've opened up jars of food that's over, I don't know, 3 or 4 years old, and it was fine. Now, what could happen is the flavor will decrease. And they do talk about that in the USDA, that flavor and minerals and vitamins and all that stuff will decrease. USDA does regulate this quite heavily. Almost every recipe that there is for canning food was developed by the USDA. And I just read an article. They actually have a little department down in the basement of the USDA. It reminds me of Fox Mulder and Scully down in the basement doing their little creepy thing. Well, same thing with the canning. They got a few people down there and they're testing different things. But they regulate a lot. I mean, back in the day, I think my grandma used to preserve meat by, she'd butcher a pig, and then she'd take all the lard, melt it down. She'd put the meat in the jar, in a pressure can jar, pour the grease on top of it, fill the jar up with grease, and that would be the way to can it. Of course, botulism was really bad back then because they didn't have all these methods established. So the USDA started establishing methods, and then, of course, just like anything, the government takes command of everything, and then everything's regulated by them. For example, it is my understanding that the USDA does not approve of canning bacon. Now, a lot of people do it, including myself. I've canned bacon. Again, don't do it unless you are aware of the risk of canning bacon. But there is no recipes, USDA developed recipes. Now, when you buy this canner, it comes with a book of instructions and recipes. Those recipes were established by the USDA. The canning company has to use those recipes in their pamphlet, in their book. These pressure canners came from Walmart. These are Presto pressure canners. It's all that I've ever used. Now, these are fairly cheap. They're probably about $100 now with inflation hitting so high this year. The other ones can get really expensive. So we bought one new, and we bought another one at a garage sale, and we only paid like $30 for that and a bunch of jars and and the water bath. We bought one new and got another one at that yard sale. I think it was kind of an estate sale. And then you can find jars at yard sales also. Now, it is hard to find jars. It is hard to find jars, and it's even harder to find metal lids. You can get on Amazon, you can find them pretty easily, but they're really high in price. At Walmart, it seems to me what they do is they put one out on the shelf, maybe one pint case and one quart case, and then if somebody buys it, then they put another one out, so people aren't buying a whole bunch of them. About once a year, Dollar General has a big sale on them. They got an end cap of them, at least here in town, and you can buy those relatively cheap. and in large quantities. But for the most part, jars are hard to find. So if you can get them at yard sales, a lot cheaper. Now the lids, those are really hard to find, metal lids. So what we did was we bought Toddler Lids. And I have playlist on Toddler Lids. You go to my channel, hit playlist, you'll see the canning section. Go over there and I've canned everything. And there's also a video where I use Toddler Lids. Now, a lot of these channels who do canning, they're canning channels, that's primarily what they do. They will tell you not to use Toddler Lids when canning meats, only vegetables. And I understand what they're saying. Toddler Lids can get the grease in between the seals. What it is, I wish I'd have brought one out. It's a white cap, it has a rubber ring that is detachable. It's 2 pieces. And they're reusable. Now they say that they last for 10 uses, the rubber seals, but the plastic piece, the white plastic piece, lasts forever. Now the instructions on the box says that these rubber seals last for 10 years. So I don't know if it's 10 years or if it's 10 uses or one or the other. Regardless, so what we try to do is we have like 200 Toddler Lids and we can reuse them. So that'd be like 2,000 uses that we would get out of them. So what we try to do is we use the same Toddler Lids over and over and over again until we get 10 uses out of them. Then we open up a new box. That way when the seals start failing, we can just throw the seals away because we know, well, it's getting close to 10 uses or 10 years or whatever the case is. Obviously, we haven't come close to that. Now, Toddler Lids is an interesting story. A bunch of them were made back in the 70s by this company, and he stopped selling them. After the lid shortage in 2020 because of the pandemic, he started reselling them again. Well, his son started a different company. I forget the name of that company. So he's competing with his father. But I'm fine with Toddler Lids. I mean, you can, whatever the other name is, you could get those. They basically are the same. I have not found anything about the USDA saying that there's an approved use for Toddler Lids. Toddler Lids are a little bit tricky. You can't over tighten them when you're canning them. There's a whole method. Again, look at my playlist, shows you how to do it. So this is just another point I've been trying to make here recently, that the government is trying to regulate our lives on everything. Wood stoves, solar panels, tiny houses, all these videos I've been making here recently. Well, here's another one, canning. It's highly regulated. Now, some will say, well, that's a good thing. And you can see their point. It's a good thing that the government came in and said, look, you know, canning is dangerous and we're going to have a law. On the other hand, why couldn't Presto, the company who made the canner, come up with these designs? Why do our taxpayers have to pay to say, look, this is unsafe, so you got to do it this way? And so you get on the internet and you see if you can can bacon. Oh no, you can't can bacon, can't can bacon, then you can't can bacon, and it's crazy. There will be people in the comment section who will insist that if you can bacon, you're gonna die. Yet I've canned 2 10-pound boxes last year and we've ate every bit of it. We just opened up the last jar and I haven't died yet. But that's how adamant people are that the USDA knows what they're doing when it comes to canning. What I find interesting is some of these people will also say we're overregulated, the government interferes with our lives too much, but then when you say something like USDA, they'll say, oh, gotta have the USDA. As a matter of fact, I just watched a video of this guy and he is anti-government all the way. I mean, you would think that if he could do away with the government, he would. But just the other day, he says, oh no, I think the FDA and the USDA is important because I want food safety. What you have to understand about that is the USDA, up until recently, I mean, like for the last 50, 60, 70 years, they used to take every piece of meat. This was the law. You had to take every piece of meat and you took this pin, it's a wooden dowel or something, plastic dowel, and they would jab it into the meat and sniff it and determine if it was good or bad by the sniff. Well, it turned out that if one piece of meat was bad and it got passed because the guy couldn't smell it was bad, and then the bacteria would get passed on to the next piece of meat that wasn't bad because of that poker. The government really doesn't make food safe. As a matter of fact, all it does is kind of identify when food isn't safe. Oh, there's a recall on meat because it was bad. I used to be a consultant and I would go to different companies, including laboratories. Now, these laboratories would test meat. The meat would come in, a batch of meat, whatever lot number it was, they would test it, see if it had E. coli or Listeria, or, you know, the 7 deadly bacteria. But that doesn't mean that every piece of meat was good. What that means is they would test it, and if it had Listeria in it, then they would say, oh, you need a recall. So people had already bought the food before it was identified that there was a problem. So USDA doesn't make things safer. It only identifies what's bad. Now, I do recognize that canning has become safer since the 50s, but I do think that companies could have done that. I think if people would have said, hey, presto, why don't you come out with a recipe and I'll buy the recipe of approved methods. I think private citizens could have done it, because people who don't can still have to pay the taxes for people who do can. So the government controls every aspect of our lives, and I try to get away from it as much as possible. Can't totally get away from it, but I try to get away from it as much as possible. I come out to Missouri in the middle of nowhere where they don't require that I have a permit to build a tiny house or solar panels. And I just kind of stay off the radar as much as possible. I recognize I'm on YouTube. Somebody's going to say, oh, you're on YouTube. I get it. That is just the downside of having a job on YouTube. But I do try to stay off the radar as much as possible. I don't associate with a lot of people. And these agencies tend to leave me alone. So if you'll click this up next box, it'll take you to a video where I talked about gardening and how the government interferes with that. So I hope I can inspire you to try canning so you can preserve your food when you're living your dream. Thanks for watching.